SCP-6959. A very strange Fumo. This video was initially meant to be an April Fool's post. However, life had other plans and I couldn't get this out on time. Even then, the only gag part of this would have been me imitating the Exploring series. Back on the subject of this SCP, I will quote the Exploring series himself, since I think he puts this a lot better than I did in the initial draft of this video. I know what you might be thinking. What happened to when SCPs were just about weird statues and creepy stairwells, instead of the end of the world and pop culture references? Truth be told, there have been SCPs related to practically every aspect of life, including quite a number connected to video games and movies. Anomalies can appear in any form imaginable, because that's what makes them anomalous. End quote. Everything from Coca-Cola that makes you too fast, Garfield but evil, Waldo, or Wally for some, but evil, a powerful entity trapped in Minecraft, another entity trapped in Among Us, and players trapped in Quake, and a Fortnite one that I haven't read yet. And there's likely many more that exist that I haven't even read yet. Nothing in the universe, and nowadays especially the multiverse, can escape the anomalous grasp. However, in this case, things are a little different. Before we start, there's a few more things I'd like to say. First being that this script is a bit old, so I don't know if this SCP has been updated or not. We will be covering the very first version of it. I will say right off the bat that if you're going to read it before listening to me or not, if you have already, or if you have already read it, that I admit this SCP may not be the best written, but it's also not terrible. I will explain more later, but my point being, keep your extremities low, since I know how easy it is for people on the internet to view things as either the next best thing besides water, or the next worst thing besides Hitler. Finally, please remove any biases you have against Fumos, Toho Project, or the fans. I am also going to say this right now, but I think that despite its connections to the source materials, and maybe its connection to a meme, that I think this SCP stands well on its own. With that out of the way, let's get started. SCP-6959 looks like a Fumo plush. Specifically, the ones based on the Cirno character from Toho Project, a series of mangas and games, not including Lost Word, since that is a fan game, and the situation with Toho and fan games is unique to say the least, but that will be explained another day. The only real difference at first glance between a standard Fumo plush and this SCP would be the lack of a tag that would usually be found on its rear. Despite looking like a Cirno Fumo in texture, color, and everything, the object is completely made out of strange matter. Strange matter sounds like some cheesy sci-fi trash fiction thing. But upon searching it up, it turns out it's actually something that exists in science, at least in theory. I'll get to that later. This SCP was first discovered when a NASA drone spotted it on a collision course with Earth. The danger of this SCP comes from the fact that any matter that comes into contact with it becomes part of itself. It would take 5 hours for the Earth to be completely destroyed because of this. To counteract its effects, the object is suspended mid-air by using electromagnets. If the power supplying those electromagnets fail, the room is flooded with water until containment is repaired. The flooding, I'd imagine, would keep it from touching the ground and likely burrowing through the core and imploding the planet, or causing some other disaster. The last thing that this article mentions is that the origin of this SCP is unknown and that further research is required. Simple, right? Well, we're not done yet. Thankfully, we have level 4 access to the rest of the page. Before moving on, the initial impression this gives is very simple, almost like something from early SCP, but without much of the mystery or terror. A simple, everyday object given ridiculous properties whether or not related to the original object's purpose. Now moving on, things start to get a little more interesting. The second part of the page is the same SCP description, but the image is of the creation of the object itself. A bright blue light amidst endless darkness. The object was created by the fusion of 2 neutron stars and was sent flying to Earth upon creation. Continuing to the extended SCP page, we see the standard experimentation and interrogation that we would expect from the SCP Foundation. The relevant characters here being Site Director Evan Rorens and temporary co-site director Everett Chalmers, with Dr. Rorens supervising the experiment and Dr. Chalmers documenting and interpreting the information. Before they start the first experiment, they pretty much talk to each other and they pretty much express their feelings towards this, sort of like another day on the Foundation kind of deal. First, they test acid and the flamethrower on it. Of course, it doesn't get damaged at all. Whether it's because it can't be destroyed or because it absorbs the matter too fast is unknown. With the test proving to not yield much results, they move on to the next logical thing. They start testing reality anchors on the Fumo to see if this is another case of reality buffoonery in the SCP universe. In addition, they also start testing if the object is a cognitohazard of some sorts. To their surprise, there's no reality bending involved or any hazardous memes that are present in the object. That is, if you exclude the typical reactiveness people express towards Fumos. Quite a real-life phenomenon, I would say. But that's also for another video. In a world where there are such things like reality-bending entities, cosmic gods, deadly ideas and images, and such other things exist, you begin to wonder what exactly we're dealing with here, if it's none of these. Perhaps simply one of these but at a higher level? Anyway, they move on to questioning the Angel-type Dojin Circle, the Fumo manufacturers, and eventually Zune himself. After getting nothing, it even reached the point where they even torture Zune himself. The SCP Foundation is known for doing some questionable stuff for the sake of the world, containment, and really whatever they need to further their goals. However, in this case, it wasn't really justified. These actions did not sit well with Dr. Rorens. Dr. Chalmers argues against Dr. Rorens' proposal that the SCP may just be an explained type, meaning that there's nothing anomalous about it, and expresses the necessity to gather as much info as possible since the object is capable of destroying the world. He also refuses to believe that something that has existed since the beginning of the universe, and could be the perfect state of matter, to just happen to look exactly like a Fumo Cirno plush. I'll explain the whole perfect state of matter thing later, since I know it sounds really dumb without context. Now for the last test. The Thaumaturgy Research Wing do a procedure on the SCP. The procedure is a reverse-engineered spell from the Serpent's Hand that determines whether or not something is anomalous or not. I'm guessing that by anomalous, they mean that if something were to defy the laws of the universe, directly bend it with no real reasonable cause, or maybe if it originates from another universe and uses their laws. I know that the concept of what it means to be anomalous is something that has been talked about in the SCP Wiki, but I think it's best to assume this as an overall, does this thing mess with the local universe's stuff or not, determiner type type of spell. The spell is your standard chalk, blood, candles, and item in the middle type of ritual. After it's done, the spell determines that the object is non-anomalous. Dr. Chalmers starts freaking out and refuses to approve the classification of this SCP as explained despite the evidence. This ends up in them getting in an argument, with Dr. Chalmers putting out an actual Cirno Fumo he went out of his way to buy. This ends in a fight which ends in the O5 Council themselves interfering, the SCP not being classified as explained, and Dr. Chalmers getting a psychiatric evaluation. Now at the end, let me explain what strange matter is, although you probably already picked up on it from reading this. Strange matter is supposedly the original matter. It supposedly forms when external pressure is zero in the core of neutron stars. It is thought that under the right circumstances, nuclear matter, which is what we would usually see as normal physical matter, would become strange matter under those conditions. If you know about the Big Bang and the Big Crunch, maybe you'll start making connections like I have, but I cannot say much about its connection. I read about this on Wikipedia, and I suggest you do your own reading since I am not qualified to understand everything it tries to tell me. But basically, although this SCP is a theorized scientific thing that makes sense in our universe and is public knowledge and involved with all that science stuff, its natural form coincides with the form of a Fumo Cirno and not just some abstract blob like we would expect things like this in science to look like. In my opinion, what makes this SCP different from every other mundane object that will kill everything if something isn't done about it is the fact that it's based on science. It's not a nail clipper that will give you testicular torsion if you don't cut off a piece of your foreskin with it. It's not a cup of water that is actually the full power of the sun in stable liquid form. And both of these are not SCPs to my actual knowledge, but I'm sure you understand what my point here is. This SCP is based on science, and it just happens to take a bit of an unusual shape. And it's interesting to see an object that is within the grasp of being explained, or being explainable within human reach, but humanity is just not there yet because of one critical thing. An object that is just a normal thing within our universe, still dangerous but explainable, is being contained because of its peculiar appearance. And that is what makes this pretty unique. For those who do not really understand why this is such a big deal to the scientists, given that this is already explainable within theory, it's as if humanity had found a way to make a scientifically acceptable way of creating a machine that generates infinite energy. However, for the machine to work, the pieces line up to look exactly like Betty Boop. It's a perhaps not perfect way to compare this, but the point being that it's an aspect of the universe looking just like something that exists in modern-day pop culture that already provokes a strong response from people. Now onto my opinions, criticisms, and related thoughts. This is an average viewer's eye video after all, as you can see in the title of the video. And April Fool's Day is long gone. For this year anyways. It's a rather simple SCP. Not knee-deep in lore, not extensive experimentation logs, and no real dread, I could say. But I think its implications does give it a place in the SCP universe. To be honest, I understand using the 3D model instead of an actual plush. Getting a Fumo is difficult, especially before the boom, and getting a good picture location is also another thing. And at the time of making this, there were no pre-orders like there are now in the AmiAmi site, so it was especially difficult to get a Fumo. But why a Fumo? Why not a teddy bear or some alien toy or a Beanie Baby or a Webkins? I've mentioned that Fumos promote strong reactions from humans. Teddy bears are fairly generic and I feel they would lessen the impact on the reader. An alien toy, this is a point I saw in the discussions of this SCP, while a neat idea, would still not be as effective as having something relatively familiar and still silly to be the object used, since we already know what this object is and we know that it's not supposed to do that. It's not some kind of artifact or something like that. It's just a regular item, albeit one of modern day and not one of the old days, I would say. Maybe the SCP would benefit if it were discovered before Fumos were invented, although I don't know how Foundation tech was back then, so I'm not sure the current containment procedures would have been possible. And then having Fumos be created afterwards, even though the SCP is in containment, maybe that would be more effective. But at that point, that's just me trying to add my own spin to this, and it's not real criticism, I guess. Okay, but why not a Funko Pop? It could also work, but I think that Cirno plush's smug expression is more impactful than the mouthless face of your typical Funko Pop. The pace of the experiment logs doesn't really overstay its welcome, and that goes for the whole SCP. And it's nice to have something relatively simple to read. Not to say that there aren't better SCPs that handle this kind of pacing, or that do it better. However, I cannot blame anyone who feel that the pace may be a bit too fast, and that the convenient anomalous testing spell felt a bit odd, in my opinion. Personally, I would have preferred if the spell would have been more specific, as in, does this defy local universal law, or a spell that detects something like that. This entry also has a decent amount of self-awareness that isn't obnoxious, but it reminds you that the Foundation is staring intently at this strange material plush. Personally, I do not mind it since I get the point, but I wouldn't blame anyone for being bothered by this. However, there's one big issue I have with this article, and that's it comes off as amateurish. And I cannot really pinpoint exactly what it is about us that comes out that way, but it's just something that's there. Sorry for not being able to really emphasize on this since I'm just an average viewer. So you'll probably notice it better than I do when reading through this. Now here's something interesting. I admit I did not pick up on the fact that this SCP is literally the infamous "I am the strongest" meme that Cirno is usually associated with. It didn't even cross my mind. I don't really care for the meme, but if you suffer from spontaneous rage from interacting with this concept or with this meme, then this SCP definitely isn't for you. Honestly, this SCP exists independent of the meme, so it doesn't really bother me that much. In fact, I was able to see it independently, and maybe that's just me. Maybe I'm the only person who is capable of doing that, but that's just how I feel about it. One may argue that memes don't really have a place in the SCP universe, despite the fact that there is a gore-fueled SCP, and there are probably others as well that are similar to that. But this is absurd. A meme plush can't be in the SCP universe. It's too ridiculous. Have I told you about Clown Milk? And there's also another SCP that is a guy who sees everything as Shia LaBeouf, which I like to say is ridiculous, but I also found it kind of interesting. I do not know the number of that one, but you can find it yourself. Not all SCPs are terrifying, and not all of them need to be. Honestly, I don't mind this SCP having a place in the wiki. But if you want something that's similar but scarier, then I'd recommend SCP-2460, The Dark Satellite. If you want a more traditional SCP experience, go check that one out. It's actually a pretty good one. I know that I'm just rambling about random points now, but I feel that I need to set everything down neatly in order to explain the more skeptic crowd on why this SCP isn't terrible, especially just because it has a Fumo in it. And I get the mixed reactions. Cirno is a popular character who is associated with overused memes. SCPs using popular media have to be interesting to warrant their place, such as the Minecraft one, for example. If this SCP were about something like a Beanie Baby or something old, then this would not get as much backlash as it does, which I find completely unfair, to be honest. The meme cycle has already reached the point where you can make a person's heart rate go to 200 BPM alone in rage with a Fumo plush. And to be honest, that's the whole reason why I had to go out of my way to make this video, because I feel like people were being too blind to their own biases rather than just seeing this SCP as what it is and not criticizing it for the real reason it needs to be criticized. A non-anomalous SCP may seem strange too, but you must also take into account that the Foundation's utter priority is to maintain normalcy. Even if it's normal by the standards of the universe, People and their biases and perceptions is what keeps this normal universal object from being normal in human eyes. Honestly, and I'll say this again, my main issue with this SCP is that it comes off as amateurish. I'm not sure if there's a way to keep the self-awareness while keeping a more main entry SCP tone, or something akin to that would be possible, but there's probably a way to do that. And if that would be fixed, then this SCP would make a good addition. And need I remind you that not all SCPs need to be just bombastic bangers. There are some SCPs out there that are neat that they exist, but they aren't exactly extravagant. And that's also fine. They can be good, they can be a neat object that exists. Not all SCPs need to be the Scarlet King. Also, I don't know how people will feel about the part with Zune. It's in character for the people of the Foundation to do anything they can to get answers. And it's not like the actions taken aren't criticized. But maybe that part of the article may rub some people the wrong way. As of now, the concept alone and the main story of it is what keeps it afloat. It wouldn't be the first time the SCP alone isn't that interesting, but the implications and things around it are what's focused on. Such is the case in SCP-5000, essentially an anti-mimetic suit, if I remember correctly. Sure, it's not that grand this time, but I'm sure you understand the similarities. Does a Fumo belong in the SCP universe? I don't know. Does anything belong in the SCP universe? In conclusion, the concept behind this SCP is fine. The concept it focuses on is something interesting, although not something that hasn't been done before, and that's also fine. The science element is the most divisive part, not because of the science, but because of the value of the science fiction part of this SCP will vary in importance to different people. The main issue of this SCP is that it comes off as amateurish, and I'm not sure how to explain that particular point further. It's something that you will probably notice when reading through it. In the SCP universe, concepts can sometimes create or change things, such as the saying that life imitates art. But in this case, art imitates life. And by life, I mean the universe. But when something doesn't match that expectation of terror, then things start getting weird. Amidst the eyeballs and tentacles, things specifically meant to kill humanity, terrors beyond our realm, and mundane things taken way too far, maybe despite everything, in the end, as it was at the beginning, all of us, everything and everyone, are all funky on the inside. This SCP gets a 6 out of 10. Not bad by the standards of the average viewer's eye series. For those who want a clear reference to how I grade these, check out, I should be putting this kind of sign up there, or maybe one of the last videos that pop up here in front of you. But either way, that should explain how I grade these. Thank you for listening, and this has been Starbolt, and I'll see you in the future.